The sun also emits a higher energy UVC light, like the kind created by the germ falcon.
Sooryayog, who has in-depth and intuitive knowledge of modern science, the daring philosopher who's enlightened with the photonism of soul consciousness. Sooryayog is a companion of wounded souls in a world that is lulled by the moans of death. The prophet of sun, without any mask of an ascetic, is empowered with sun as a weapon to transform the world. He believes that only a lifestyle based on scientific knowledge can protect this generation tormented by despair and anguish. Sooryayog calls for the creation of a new world based on love and peace, a single unified nation.
Another area that I wanted to talk about that I think is going to have a real role in how we get this country back open again and how we get our hospitals back into shape again so we can start doing elective surgeries and things of that nature is actually an article that was published over 2 years ago. And it is titled Far UVC Light, a new tool to control the spread of airborne-mediated microbial diseases. It almost seems as though this came out just at the right time. So everybody knows that ultraviolet light comes from the sun, but you may not know that there are different types of ultraviolet light. There's ultraviolet A here, there's ultraviolet B here, and there's ultraviolet C. Now, we never actually get to see ultraviolet C because as soon as it hits the stratosphere and comes down, it essentially doesn't get past the ozone layer, which is what this light yellow line is. What we usually see when it finally hits Earth is we see a lot of ultraviolet A and we see a little bit of ultraviolet B. And it's really some of this A and a lot of this B, although we just see a little bit of the B, that causes cataracts and causes skin cancer and can cause a lot of problems. And the reason is because it can penetrate into the skin, down into the growing layers of our skin tissue and mess up the DNA and cause malignancies. Now, just like it is when you pull up to a stop sign or a traffic light and that car next to you is playing some really loud music, what do you typically hear? You hear the bass, because the bass is able to penetrate through their car and into your car because it's a longer wave. The shorter waves, the higher sounding notes, don't penetrate as well. And that's the same thing here. Even though this is on the shorter wavelength side of the spectrum, UVA has a longer wavelength than UVC. And because of that, UVA is lower in energy. UVC is actually higher in energy, but it can't penetrate as well. So this lower wavelength can penetrate deeper into the skin. UVB can also penetrate up to some point, and it does have higher energy, but it doesn't penetrate as deeply. UVC, which is the highest in energy, also known as far UV, is in the wavelength of 207 nanometers to 222 nanometers. The number to keep in mind here is 222. That should be pretty easy to keep in mind. And that's the wavelength that we're talking about with UVC. Again, we hardly ever see it on Earth naturally from the sun. But is there another use for it? Let's go back to that article. Again, UVA, longer wavelength relatively. It's less powerful but highly penetrating and responsible for the photoaging and facilitates the onset of skin cancer. UVB is higher in energy, but it can't penetrate as deeply, and it causes a bunch of cancer and apoptotic gene stuff. Now, if we were to generate UVC here on Earth, we're not going to get it from the sun because it's not going to be able to penetrate the ozone layer. But if it were to come down, what would it do and how far would it penetrate? Let's learn more about UVC, especially at the wavelength of 222. So here again is that journal article from Nature. And what they set out to do was essentially this. Take a solution filled with influenza virus and nebulize it into a chamber. This is called the aerosol exposure chamber. And then while it was aerosolized, just like, for instance, coronavirus would be aerosolized, but they didn't know that at the time because this was 2 years ago. But influenza, if it was aerosolized, hit it with this ultraviolet light exposure at a specific wavelength of 222. And then take the viral particles out and put them on a dish to see whether or not they could infect. In other words, could UV exposure in the far UV district of 222 inactivate these viral particles? So here is the results of that. And so they did it without any kind of UVC light. What you can see here is blue being the nucleus of the cells, and these small green things being the virus. So you can see clearly here that these cells are just socked in full of infected virus. Then they start to turn up the amplitude on this 222 nanometer light, and you can see here at 0.8 millijoules per square centimeter, they've cut down on the amount of infections. Here at 1.3 millijoules per square centimeter, there's even less. And finally, when they crank up the amplitude to 2.0 millijoules, we just see one cell that gets infected. And so looking at that on a logarithmic scale, and as we start to increase the amplitude of the energy that's being produced, what we see here is the fractional survival go down to essentially somewhere between 1/10 to 100th on a logarithmic scale, so about almost 90% reduction at 2.0. So you say, okay, well, we already have this ultraviolet light in hospitals and ultraviolet light everywhere else. What's so new about this? Why is this so good? Well, the really cool thing about UVC, especially at the 222 nanometer dose, is it doesn't cause any skin problems and it doesn't cause any cataracts. And the reason is because it can't penetrate more than, well, less than a cell thickness. In other words, this uses the advantage of the fact that viruses are so small that the light has to penetrate only a small distance, and it will completely eliminate and annihilate the genome of these viruses, but it will not touch even living cells in the human body. In fact, even the tear layer on the surface of the cornea is thicker than this UVC light can penetrate. They say here, by contrast, we have shown earlier that far UVC light generated by filtered excimer lamps emitting in the 207 to 222 nanometer wavelength range efficiently inactivates drug-resistant bacteria without apparent harm to exposed mammalian skin. By the way, they do it here with influenza A, which is a virus. It doesn't matter if this is drug-resistant bacteria, or just regular bacteria, or drug-resistant viruses, or microbes. It so severely disables the RNA and the DNA that the virus uses that no matter what kind of organism it is, it's not going to live. They go on to talk about here, the approach is based on biophysical principles that far UVC light can traverse and therefore inactivate bacteria and viruses, which are typically micrometer dimensions or smaller, whereas due to its strong absorbance in biological materials, far UVC light cannot penetrate even the outer dead cell layers of the human skin, nor the outer tear layer on the surface of the eye. And here they showed that an H1N1 influenza A virus was inactivated, and they reproduced the generated aerosol droplets of sizes similar to those generated by human coughing and breathing. Now here's the key in terms of opening up the country again. It says here, if these results are confirmed in other scenarios, it follows that the use for overhead, low-level far UVC light in public locations may represent a safe and efficient methodology for limiting the transmission and spread of airborne-mediated microbial diseases such as influenza and tuberculosis. In fact, the potential use of ultraviolet light for airborne disinfection is by no means new and was first demonstrated more than 80 years ago. As applied more recently, airborne ultraviolet germicidal irradiation utilizes conventional germicidal UVC light in the upper part of the room with louvers to prevent direct exposure of potentially occupied room areas. This results in blocking of more than 95% of the UV radiation exiting from the UVGI fixture with substantial decrease in effectiveness. By contrast, the use of what they're using here, far UVC fixtures, which are potentially safe for human exposure, they could provide the desired antimicrobial benefits without the accompanying human health concerns of conventional germicidal lamp UVGI. So the key here is that by using the far spectrum, you can get higher energy, kill the virus, and it doesn't even penetrate the outer layer of the skin. So why don't we already have it? Well, here's an article in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Overhead far UVC lights could be used in any indoor location where people congregate, including in hospitals, doctors' offices, schools, airports, airplanes, trains, buses, and other public spaces, and could help block the spread of the coronavirus. And they talk about the 2018 paper that looked at far UVC light and killing airborne viruses without harming human tissues. Here's the key, though. The two roadblocks for using this are ramping up to high capacity production and FDA approval, Mr. Brenner said. A couple of weeks ago, my best guess for both might have been 9 months. But now we're trying to go faster than that. Last month, the FDA issued an advisory that clears the way for the use of sterilizer and disinfection devices, including the far UVC lamps in hospitals and other public health settings during the unique coronavirus pandemic and prior to formal FDA approval. This may be part of the formula that we see in terms of getting this country back on its feet, and yet also making sure that we don't go back into another epidemic and increase in cases.